Hey Tobias, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And we've nearly crossed paths a few times. I enjoyed your talk at the recent Animal Advocacy Conference at the University of Kent. We've both been on our hen house, and I've been lucky enough to interview both Jasmine and Marianne for this podcast too. And
Okay.
also Michael Dello, I know you are on his Morality is Hard podcast too as well. So we've almost crossed paths in a number of different places. So it's great to get the chance to talk to you because I've admired your work for a long while.
Yeah, thank you.
So, as this is a series of conversations about what I see as the two deepest philosophical questions, really, what's real and what matters. And I'm framing it in the context of sentientism, which I'm suggesting should answer those questions in two ways. One, we should take a naturalistic approach that uses evidence and reason and rationality to understand the world, always imperfectly. And when it comes to what matters, we should focus, the clue is in the name, on sentience as the most important characteristic for us thinking about which entities should get moral consideration, what should we care about. But I'm talking in this series of conversations to people who agree and disagree with that philosophy. So it'll be fascinating to understand your own personal journey. But before we get onto those two big questions, how would you best introduce your life and your work for people who don't know you?
Yeah, so I'm 48 now, and I would mostly describe myself or have been involved in the last 20, 25 years of my life with animal or vegan advocacy. So I have run an organization, a nonprofit, as a director for 15 years in Belgium. I left that 5 years ago. Then I started to like more do meta-activism. So I was more into passing on what I had learned, my experiences during that 15-year period, passing it on to other activists and suggesting how they can talk better to people and do better activism. And I have written a book, How to Create a Vegan World, that summarizes my view, my strategy, my findings. It contains an idea to build a vegan world, basically. I give talks for companies. I am a co-founder at ProVeg International, which is the biggest vegan organization in the world. And I'm working on another book, a novel that contains much of the topics that we're talking about today, I think, but fiction this time. Yeah, that's about it.
That's a great intro. Thank you. Yeah. So the first question we like to ask is what's real? And so for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in quite a naturalistic, scientific, materialistic sort of worldview in their family and society, or one that was more supernatural and spiritual, maybe mystical, and how that side of their philosophy has changed through their life, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like into your childhood, but it'd be nice to know your personal story and where you are now on that side of philosophy.
Yeah, there's nothing much that springs out or that jumps out in my childhood or youth or upbringing in terms either of religious inspired content or scientific inspired content. So my parents were like not very explicit on either. There was a period when my mom, there's this 12 year this thing for Catholics where at 12 you do something. I don't know how it is called in English, but where you
Yeah, like
get like,
a confirmation.
yeah,
Yeah.
confirmation. So I did that, and I did some church going sessions in the year before that to prepare for that or something. And I went to Catholic school, but it was all, this is supposed to be what you're doing, and you're supposed to do that. That was all very pro forma. And later it just dwindled or it just fizzled out. And yeah, then I went to church only for funerals. So there was not much in terms of religious upbringing. And presently, I will always defend rationality and reason and evidence and scientific worldviews, etc.
Hmm.
And yet, at the same time, I'm a bit schizophrenic, and I'm really not sure if I understand myself in that respect. And sometimes, or in many fields, I feel like I'm torn. And this is also, I wouldn't say I'm torn, but I would say like I'm definitely not the most devout atheist you can find.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well
um,
chosen words.
I don't know if you would ask, I guess you are an atheist and many other people, like if you would ask them, like, are you completely confident that when you die, nothing bad will happen? I can't say yes to that, or nothing extraordinarily good will happen.
Yeah.
I really can't say that I'm confident that it will all be just silence after I die. And the same for reincarnation so it's always somewhere there. It's always like the
Yeah.
possibility of something more, of a plan, or of I don't know what is always there. And at the same time, sometimes I think like all these things, these religious ideas. So it's interesting how many of the religious ideas that we have in our culture and in other cultures, that they could be at some point made possible technologically. If you think of the far, far future, reincarnation or ending suffering and all these things, like, and then sometimes I think like maybe I have these ideas because they're like a far memory of a remembrance of something that someday was and will be technologically possible, if that makes sense. Like, maybe there was some other kind of like intelligence here at some point. So maybe religious ideas are like some kind of a version of what is technologically possible, or what has been technologically possible in other societies or by other intelligences or something. I think it's interesting how in science fiction movies or series you can see sometimes aliens having invented reincarnation or like making people live again, those kind of things. And maybe that's just gotten confounded somehow.
Maybe God is just the teenager running the simulation on the laptop in his bedroom.
Yeah, that is also, who knows? Yeah, who knows?
And it's interesting the way you set that out, because I think some people who have a naturalistic and an atheistic worldview would say with almost basically 100% confidence those things aren't true. There is no religions or fabrications and so on. And I do have some sympathy with that view, because I do think they're vanishingly unlikely. And as I've learned about religions, it seems more and more obvious that they are, very human creations driven much more by human psychology and society than any real understanding of the world. But I think actually that uncertainty and that leaving some space of possibility, even for crazy sounding ideas, is an important part of a naturalistic worldview as well, because as soon as you're 100% confident in something, you've closed the door to any new evidence. And I think the history of science has shown that sometimes even crazy ideas do prove to be true. Yeah, so I always like to leave at least a little bit of that freedom.
Yeah, you could almost say that if you're 100% certain of those things, then it becomes another religion almost. Like then you cannot like really base it on anything like that. You're 100% certain of it. I think Richard Dawkins also said like he's 99% certain or something.
I'm probably with him. I'm in the 99s, but I think leave a little glimmer of the door open just for that intellectual curiosity and openness.
Yeah.
And it sounds as though the other thing I think that's interesting is that there are, while I do think that most religious supernatural ways of thinking are, fabrications, really, there's something that psychologically might actually link to the way reality really is. And I think there are themes there. So as you say, if you think about concepts of sci-fi actually being able to bring some religious ideas into reality, whether it's cryogenics or cloning or replicating human consciousness in some other substrate, there's many of those ideas do echo through. So I think there's value in thinking through those parallels. And
so maybe meld together at some point.
And I guess the difference for me would be that if there is a teenager running this universe as a simulation on his computer, that teenager still does exist in a naturalistic world, and the hardware he's running the simulation exists. That is still, for me, radically different from the idea of a supernatural thing, which has some sort of magical, mysterious, ephemeral, ineffable essence. And so I think if we were to discover that the teenager is running a simulation, that's still absolutely part of a naturalistic worldview. We haven't.
Yeah, absolutely. So there wouldn't be anything. This becomes like a semantic discussion in the end, I guess. Like, but if there is a supernatural being, then you would down the road with enough technology and enough knowledge discover their nature.
So, and arguably, once you've discovered evidence of something supernatural, it's no longer supernatural because you've used natural means to detect it.
Yeah. So what is supernatural? It's hard to say, I think. I also like the idea of the gods, as this famous book, If the Gods Were Cosmonauts or something. I don't know the title in English, but he said like the gods that arrived, or the aliens that arrived a long time ago, they were seen and interpreted as gods. So the gods that we have, they were real, normal, natural beings, which were changed into gods over the centuries or millennia, which is like I'm very interested in aliens and religion and everything and the combination of that. So
that's fascinating. And I think the other commonality I find is that often, even though I have quite a hard-edged naturalistic worldview, I can get a very similar emotional experience to many religious people when we're talking about things like this, because I think I get a sense of awe and wonder and connectedness of all things and possibilities, purely through a very scientific, naturalistic understanding of the world. And I think there's probably quite a lot in common with the sort of transcendent sense that people with the supernatural worldview are looking for and find in religious ways of thinking.
I understand what you mean, even though that I think that religious feeling might still be different. And I couldn't speak from experience. The closest I got was experiences with hallucinogenics, which I think are some of the most interesting things in the world. But there I had some religious feeling experiences, which of course, there you can see, this is naturalistically explained by chemicals in your body that do this and this, caused by the chemicals in the psychedelic. But still, if you experience it, it's like, at that moment, it's very real. And even at that moment, you think it might not be real. It might just be these chemicals, but somehow it feels real. So that is still different, I think, than the experience of like the awe of like how natural selection works or.
And understandably, there's something that feels very special about the nature of our own experience. By definition, it is, if maybe the only thing we're actually experiencing. So it is very tempting to think of it as something that's distinct or different or disconnected from the rest of reality. And that's another fascinating field that sometimes I get into with my guests, because I tend to have still a very strong materialistic view that our experience is just what it feels like to run this class of evolved information processing. Whereas others do think there is a genuine, really hard problem of consciousness that almost by definition, what we're experiencing can't just be the information processing. There has to be something beyond the matter and the energy. But that's another fascinating, challenging topic. Right. But I think regardless of what consciousness and what sentience is, they're still of central moral importance to me, whether they're illusory, whether they're materialistic, whether there is something quantum, where there's something extra. In a way, I don't mind that much. They're still of central moral importance. And that's,
as long as there's an experience and somebody who benefits or suffers from that experience, even that experience is like simulated or whatever, as long as there is an awareness, then it matters.
Yeah. And I think that we'll come on to that in the second question we talk about. But I wanted to just quickly go back to your experience of growing up in a sort of Catholic context and then that fading away. Some of my guests actually had a really difficult journey out of a religious culture or context because it was so central to the culture. Sometimes it was, quite oppressive in its nature. There were social penalties for leaving. It was very difficult. Now, you and I didn't have that experience. It was a much more sort of background cultural traditional pattern that we just did, and then it faded away. Was there any point where it felt difficult for you, either intellectually, emotionally, or societally, to leave Catholicism, or was it just faded into irrelevance?
I don't even have the impression that I ever left Catholicism. It was not like, it really filled out. But I would say to your question, like, even without having that explicit difficulty of having to leave some system or whatever, I think what also could be the case is that these cultural ideas, even if you heard them just once at a very young age, they might have left an impression that lasts with you forever. Like, I do still remember something my great-grandmother, something she said about the devil and hell, and it stayed with me forever. And I think that also might explain, for instance, like a movie, The Exorcist, for instance. I don't know if you've seen it, but I saw it when I was 14 or something. It's like
shocking to see at 14. It's quite shocking to see at 48.
Yeah, for some reason it was the only movie my mom allowed me, like adult movie my mom allowed me to finish till the end. I don't know why she did that. She made a mistake. But I wonder, would it be so scary if I hadn't been brought up with some of those ideas, or if I hadn't heard them before? Or why is that movie so scary? It almost feels like it's so scary because there's some ingrained, instinctual, I don't know what content there. Do you know what I mean? Rationally,
Yeah. And one of the reasons I'm interested in this question of, what's real in the epistemology side of things is, one, just intellectually, I'm interested in different ways of understanding the world, but I'm also interested in how they relate to morality, because clearly in a supernatural or a religious context, your morality often comes as part of that bundle. There's a list of rules, or you're given God as a perfect being that you're supposed to emulate, or some other figure or prophet. And so that's part of the bundle. There's a bunch of things to believe and a system that decides what is right and wrong, or what is correct and incorrect. And one of the reasons some people struggle to move away from that worldview is because they're worried they're losing their moral moorings in some sense. If I don't have this list of rules, where do I go? So some people will go down a sort of nihilist path. If I'm going to be materialist, naturalistic, nothing really matters. Others will go down a sort of relativist path where they'll say it's just up to different groups to negotiate. Others will find some other system of morality that they lock into as well. So I'm quite interested in how that sort of drift from a Catholicism you were never really invested in, but the implication being it didn't really have a strong influence on your moral thinking anyway. So in the absence of that, how would you say your morality is grounded, if it has a grounding at all? How do you think about morality and what's right?
So yeah, it didn't really have much of an impact, I think. But my parents, especially my mom, had an impact in that she raised me to be quite an ethical person and saying, you can't do this, you don't lie, you blah, blah. Or she said, when I was 12, I was already volunteering to help people with a disability. And then that stuck with me. And there was always this idea of you have to be a good person.
Yeah. And did that feel more because it was a duty or rules to follow or something about your role in society? Was it more about a compassionate thing and an empathy thing
It's hard to say. It was something for me, it felt like a bit of pressure. For her, it was this is the right thing to do. Something like that, mostly, I think. Yeah. Yeah. But to go back to your question, where does it come from? Or I'd say, I feel it was only later there was a whole time when I didn't really take that seriously, that I just lived my life at 15 and played computer games and just wanted to be a computer game programmer and didn't care. And then later, around my early 20s, it came back, and it came back especially with animals. So there I just discovered that I cared about animals, but I had cared about them all the time. And what I want to get to is, sorry for rambling a little bit, but that caring, that empathy, that it was it was there always, without being in need of a system of rules or a religious system. So it was just and I think it's for many vegans like that, they see an animal even when they're 4 or 6 or 12, and they feel this empathy, and not even vegans and many people. And you don't need a set of rules, or you don't need a God, or you don't need whatever to know that it's good to help an animal that's in pain. Not eating it is a bit of a different matter still, because then you have to make the sacrifice of not eating it. But seeing an animal on the road that is hurt or something, we don't like to see that. And we will do something. In many cases, we will interfere just because we feel to some extent what it's like to be them in that situation. So just natural empathy without needing much of a religious system, I would say. So would you be afraid of, or were you afraid of losing your morality or your moral moorings by losing your religion? I don't think I've ever been, afraid of that, though I could imagine that for a serial killer or anything, it would be hard to believe. They would have to let go of all these things of, But for me, I don't think that anything religious inspired or the morality was inspired by many religious things.
Yeah, that sense of empathy was deeper seated and earlier and more foundational, I guess.
Yeah, that was just a very intuitive thing, I think.
And that's shared by me and by many of my guests. And I think for many people, it is a sort of intuitive emotional response. You look into the eyes of a puppy or a pig or a chicken or a animal or another human, and you almost instinctively appreciate that they have a perspective and feel some sort of sense of resonance with that. So it can be quite an emotional thing, but it can also be quite a logical, technical thing as well. So I had an interesting conversation online with someone recently who was talking about sentientism and said they found it an interesting way of thinking because it was almost they personally struggle to feel empathy and compassion, and whether they would be diagnosed as a sociopath or a psychopath is difficult to say. They just didn't feel that emotional connection, but they found it interesting to find a sort of rational, logical basis for saying, I don't like suffering. I'm pretty sure other beings don't like suffering either. Morality is just a decision to care about that. So it was almost a more technical, logical approach that I think most people can complement that sort of emotional sense of connection to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think Peter Singer also wrote that in his animal liberation book. Like he said, me and my wife, we were never animal lovers. We didn't feel this connection or anything, but it was just a rational, you could just derive this from rational thinking, right? I don't like pain. they don't like pain. Even if I don't feel their pain, I just know that they don't like pain. That's just a rational reasoning, which would lead you to veganism and to all kinds of things. I think you can be you can be a vegan sociopath, so to speak. It's possible in the sense that like you don't feel others' pain, but rationally it's not good to create this pain, and the balance between like my happiness and their suffering there is no balance, and I don't get enough benefit out of their suffering, so we have to stop it. Yeah, that can entirely be done without any empathy, I think. And yeah.
And you've touched already on the second part of this what matters question, and I think this is a question that I find radically neglected by most of moral philosophy, and I think it's a little bit bizarre. Almost everybody does feel some sort of sense of compassion, whether it's logically driven or emotional. The problem is, okay, who warrants that compassion, or which entities warrant that compassion? Even homophobes and racists probably still love their immediate families. They feel compassion too. The problem is their compassion is not extended generously enough and is arbitrarily limited. You could argue that the human species on average has got many problems with that within the human species today, but there has been some degree of progress, at least in concept, as we did things after the Second World War. Most of the countries sign up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to say, look, at least theoretically, let's ignore the practicalities for the moment, the reality for the moment, at least conceptually, every human warrants moral consideration and compassion to some degree. And that's another central question in these conversations, because there's another critical break in many people's philosophical journey about when you go beyond the human species as well. So again, you've hinted at it already, in that you already had from a very early age just intuitive empathy and compassion for non-humans. And I know you've told this story, many times before, but it'll be interesting to know your personal journey about recognizing theoretically where your moral scope should go, and then playing the implications of that through in your life as well. What was your journey towards and where do you set the boundary now?
Yeah, it started with just our own companion animals, cats and dogs in our home, and loving them. And from a very early age, always having loved animals, and then wondering what the difference was between them and the cows that were just near our house and standing in the rain, and which I knew some other people would slaughter and we might eat them someday, and wondering, okay, what is the difference that the morally relevant difference between these two species or these two situations? And I couldn't find anything, and I decided that, okay, if I can't find an answer to that question, I have to stop eating animals. And then it took me a long time, because I loved eating meat. It took me about 10 years to actually stop. So there was this empathic closeness, and there was this empathy. There was the rational understanding. There was the reasoning. And still, it was not enough for me I cared, but I did not care enough, apparently, to immediately stop eating them and go vegan. That only came later.
And what's the reason? Because I had a similarly, a long journey, originally vegetarian and veganism, quite late on. You described it almost as a sort of personal trade-off. I really enjoyed eating meat versus this sort of moral sense in my mind. Was it personal? Because for other people, it's much more of a social norm thing. And what do you think made that journey longer than...
I think mainly the pleasure of eating something I love to eat. And just this very simple thing of every time when you had the choice between at a restaurant choosing a vegetarian vegan dish or the meat dish that you knew that you liked, always going for that. I see many people do that still. It really give them the option, but they know that this one thing they really love, this other thing they're not sure of. So they're going to take, frustratingly, they're still going to take that meat dish. And you just have to just get over that at some point. It's just like a slowness, an inertia that you have to conquer, I think. And yes, sometimes you need to be a little bit stimulated or forced to do it. Sometimes you need to be in a situation where you don't have any other options. Those things would make it easier. With me, it was actually a bet that I made with a friend who would give me 25 euros if I was going to be without meat for a month. And I did that. It was not difficult. I wanted to do it, but he wanted to stimulate me, even though he wasn't a vegetarian or a vegan. And I did that, and then I continued it afterwards and progressively also became a vegan. Yeah, but so the theory is, or the caring about consists of the empathy and the rational reasoning. But if you wanted to put it into practice, and that is very much part of what I write in my book, and the pragmatic idea, when you want to put it into practice, you need to make it very easy for people to care. So I have a talk that's called Making Compassion Easier. Compassion has to be easy in the sense that the consequences of compassion should not be too high, in the sense of, or the sacrifices that you have to make as a consequence of being compassionate should not be too high. You have to make sure that people actually don't have to make any sacrifice when they're compassionate. And for people and for vegans who don't understand that, it's always easy to invent or to come up with examples where any of us don't follow that rule, and where, like, I mean, we care about animals, but and we won't consume any animal products, but do we also look at our clothing all the time and everywhere? Is it always like fair trade and things like that? Is all our materials and whatever that we have in our house, is everything like from fair labor circumstances, etc.? So we all ignore some of these things, at least some of the time. And I mean, you could even bring in Peter Singer's shallow pond experiment. If I buy a new cell phone, could I not just as well or much better give those 300 or 400 euros to somebody who's poor and who needs it much more than I do? So that is a question that really is valid, I think. And so we can all see that our caring has some limits, and I think to some extent for self-preservation also, it would go crazy otherwise. But yeah, it's not like a black and white thing. It's not like some people care, some people don't, and it's not all across the board. It is selective still.
And and we'll come back to this as we talk about your philosophy about how to make the world a better place. But if we get into a position where it's either perfection or nothing, then the answer will be nothing. We have to accept that perfection isn't possible. That doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying to do what we can and finding our own balance. But before we come on to that question about making change happen, given compassion and the blockers to it, there's I think you and I probably share an approach to setting our moral scope, in that we'd reject a sort of anthropocentric human approach that says only humans matter. And to be honest, there aren't many people who really genuinely believe that in a pure sense, because even most people who are totally focused on humans still, as you and I do, have experiences with companion animals or charismatic wild animals that they do care morally about. So even most human-centric people, the boundaries already leak into other species as well. But I'd certainly reject that by going to a concept of sentiocentrism, or thinking about sentience, and any being that, as Bentham said, can they suffer, has the capacity to have subjective experiences that can be positive or negative. So that's at the core of sentientism. And I think you probably share that perspective. But there are some people who will challenge a sentientist perspective and say, look, you're not going far enough, right? In fact, the first time I think the first couple of times the word sentientist was used, it was in a critical context. So John Rodman, I think in 1977, said, look, this sentientist approach that Richard Ryder and Peter Singer are talking about is another form of discrimination, because you're now discriminating against non-sentient components of the environment, rocks and rivers and plants and trees and rivers and Gaia as an ecosystem. So a biocentrist or an ecocentrist will say sentientism and sentiocentrism is too narrow. What's your thoughts about going beyond sentience in terms of moral consideration? How do you respond to those sorts of pushbacks, or do you think they're actually valid ways?
First of all, I would say a limit is not, of course, at humans. It's not at the animals that we mistreat in our factory farms, etc. But it goes further to also the wild animals, etc. Yeah. So that's where the limits are, and then maybe artificial sentience, and then you can wonder, do microbes and viruses and whatever small stuff, do they have an experience, etc. But then as to extending it further beyond sentience, actually, I do not see the point in that. I mean, by definition, almost sentience seems to mean those who can suffer or those who can be happy. And so if you have an organism or what you have to call it, an object or something in this universe that exists, but that does not have an experience, that does not have any, that it doesn't matter to what you do to it, it doesn't seem that you have to care about it, at least not for its own sake. And that's what is so also irritating about people who want to, with all good intentions, help the environment, and they care about entities that do not have concerns, like a species, for instance, or a population. They don't have concerns or interests as a species. I think they're only these individuals have concerns. So it's not worse to killing the last panda they would consider, and in general, you could say it is worse because it is the last one of a species and the species would die out and et cetera. But how much worse is it than killing a pig, or let alone 10 or 1,000 pigs? That's hard to say. I'm just saying, like, we seem to, or environmentalists in general seem to care about things that do not care themselves, or that there is nothing to care. And so it all seems to be like, it's strange, ironically, this whole concern about the environment is, et cetera, and about the species in the environment is still very anthropocentric in a way. And I often think, are we still just talking about ourselves enjoying the presence of these species and this mountain range and whatever? So if we want to get beyond that, we just have to like step in the shoes of the beings that are here, and we have to wonder what is good for them. And is there anything that can be done for them that is good or bad anyway? In some cases, there won't be, because it's not an organism with concerns or with interests. So to come back to your question, like discrimination against non-sentients, that really doesn't make sense to me. And
I think I'd say it's the only moral discrimination, because the entities you're discriminating against don't care. They have no interests, they have no needs, they have no wishes, they have no desires. They cannot be morally harmed. So
you cannot discriminate against them, basically. And so to me, this seems like all these discussions, sometimes I wonder, are we speaking the same language? Because I'm always very careful not to assume that what I'm thinking is like the way people should think. But in these things, like thinking about suffering and thinking about interest and thinking about happiness and well-being, I always feel like the people who do not agree with this view, they're probably not understanding what we want to say, and we have to be clearer. Because I cannot imagine really fundamentally differing in opinion about these things. There's many discussions about suffering, etc., and then people will say like, yeah, but is suffering so bad? And then I say, I mean, by definition, suffering is something that's bad.
Exactly. It literally is the definition of view. And that's partly why I think it's a sentientist stance is important, because it rejects anthropocentrism, but it's also clear positive in a way. Whereas an anti-speciesist approach says, look, here's something we shouldn't use to discriminate using, right? We shouldn't discriminate based on race, or gender, or sexuality, or species. It says, here's what you shouldn't use. Sentience is, I guess, a mirror image of that, saying what we should use to discriminate on, what we should use as the characteristic is, in a more positive sense, is sentience. And I think even a sentientist, a strictly sentientist approach, and mine is, still has a rich concern for the environment. Absolutely, because we need the environment for aesthetic pleasures, for ecosystem services. All sentient beings, wild and human, need a healthy ecosystem and environment to be part of. So that's why I care about the environment. And some people will say, well, does it really matter if you intrinsically grant moral consideration to plants and rocks and rivers and so on? And I said, maybe not, as long as you absolutely grant serious moral consideration to the entities that can suffer. And to your point, sadly, most environmentalists don't do that. They're more ready to grant rights to rivers than they are to a pig or a chicken or a fish. And when you get to that stage, and I've heard it described, people who have this more ecocentric, holistic view, sometimes will even say, we are all connected, life is life. It feels like a very generous, rich, almost mystical way of thinking, that we are all part of the universe, and maybe ultimately everything is somewhat undifferentiated, right? We are all one with the universe. And as part of that universe, there's a natural process whereby life eats life. And as humans, we need to take our natural place in that process. So yes, I'll have another bowl of chicken nuggets, please. And I'm like, you start out with this really nice, warm sounding, super generous moral scope, and you've ended up using it, as you said, as really a veneer over your anthropocentrism. And I think you can play that through, right? Because it may seem a little bit harsh to say, but you can see the anthropocentrism because of the role we want other species to play, right? The reason we like and we want charismatic animals to live is because we enjoy watching them on our nature programs. The reason, we want farmed animals to die is because we like the taste of their body. You can see where the ultimate motivation is under a lot of environmentalism. It is really just a veneer on an anthropocentric view, which I think is a shame.
Yeah, I've wondered sometimes whether, talking about wild animal suffering or wild animal well-being, like if you walk in nature for purely aesthetic pleasure and you look at like the birds and the bees and the rodents and you just see you think they're just enjoying and you don't think any further, to some extent, it seems to me like comparable to going to a poor country and staying in rich hotels and like just enjoying the weather there and not knowing that there's all kinds of poor people around you suffering. That's probably the case in nature too. So that illustrates this whole, I want to enjoy the aesthetics of this, but I have no eye for the suffering that might be, and let's hope it's not too bad, but that very well might be behind and below all of this.
Yeah. And you touched on I think that one of the central intellectual things you can do, which is just take the perspective of the other individual. And we can't do that perfectly. We can't do that perfectly even with other humans. But just that switch and just thinking about it, a situation from the perspective of a non-human or another human or a farmed animal or a wild animal is such a simple switch of perspective. And all of a sudden, it seems to me a lot of the bullshit and the falls away, and you can see you don't necessarily have an easy answer, but you can at least see a problem more clearly.
Yeah, exactly. And I sometimes ask, like, to people, just imagine yourself in the situation of a wild animal being eaten alive, or if you're like having philosophical discussions and doubts about how bad suffering is, imagine yourself like with a big knife wound in your stomach or something, and not philosophize. Yeah. You will just say, please release me. You will just say, like, heal me, help me. That's all that you will say. You will not start thinking about maybe this isn't so bad or whatever. No, you want to get rid of it. And that's what we have to be able to do, to put ourselves in the position of certainly beings who are suffering extremely. And then there's no philosophy necessary, I think.
And we love to focus as humans on the things that maybe make us feel distinct. So we talk about higher cognitive capacities. We think about our ability to plan for the future, or to introspect, or to appreciate advanced aesthetics, or to learn in different ways. And one point of caution is, as the more we learn about non-humans, the more we understand that they can do those things as well. But I guess the more important point I wanted to make is that the needs and interests we have as humans that are the most fundamental, right? The ones that, as you say, will just stop us philosophizing because the need is so urgent, right? Physical pain and pleasure, the wish to keep living, sustenance, shelter, all the things at the bottom of the hierarchy, the things that we as humans see are most important, are the things that are most common across the species. And it's obvious why when you understand the basics of evolution and the history we've shared. So yes, there might be all sorts of interesting, intricate psychological differences between the species, and there's a richness and diversity there that is fascinating. But the most important needs, interests, wishes, and desires are the ones that we have most in common.
Yeah, and they might be very present with other beings in the sense that, to the extent that like their total being or their total life is just taken by those feelings. Being could be almost all fear, I can imagine. I can't know, but I can imagine. I see birds eating. Have you ever seen a bird eating, like just a wild bird eating from a bird feeder that you put? They're like this the whole time. Like maybe that is constant stress, and there's more and more research about these things. Maybe they're in constant fear. Could you imagine how terrible that is? So yeah, we have to be open to that at the very least. And we may not have any solutions, but in theory, we have to care about that. That is just, I don't know if it's much, but it is a start.
I agree. And it's heartening to hear you talk about wild animal suffering, because I think we can apply exactly that same switch of perspective and the empathy as we did do for a pig or a chicken or a fish in a farm to wild animals, right? And many people, even in the animal advocacy and the vegan movements, to my mind, have a blind spot around wild animal suffering. And there's a degree to which I understand that, because much of it is driven by a fear of human hubris and a fear of human intervention and a fear of the complexity of the problem. If a problem is really challenging and I don't know how to work with it, and I'm very skeptical about human motives of intervening in nature, it can lead you to back away from the problem completely. And I can understand all of that skepticism, but it does not give us an excuse to exclude those beings from moral consideration. You can say those problems are hard. You can say we need to do more research. You can say there are real risks. There are, second, third, fourth order problems that we might not foresee. There are impacts in ecosystems. I get all of that. It's a rich, complex, sometimes very challenging area. But we cannot exclude those entities from moral consideration. That's a different thing for me.
Yeah, it's true what you say. There are like a lot of problematic, practical issues that we can't see ourselves get around very easily. And that's why many people won't go into the thicket of the suffering or the well-being of wild animals. But there's also this other factor, which I think is crucial to, or which ties very nicely to your concepts of sentientism, I think sentientism would be to a high extent a consequentialist thing. Like, it looks at results, it looks at the actual suffering that is happening, and we don't want pain, we don't want suffering. But many vegans are looking at it from a virtue ethics viewpoint more, and they're looking at what are we doing wrong, what are we doing that is unjust and exploitative, etc., etc. And we're gonna get rid of all this unjustness and all this exploitation. And the unjustness and the exploitation you only find in the field, in the region of like where we do something wrong to animals, and that's the farmed animals thing. Yeah. But when animals are hurt by nature, there is pain and there is suffering, but there is no wrongdoing. And that's why they won't get into it, because they don't think it's their field. While from a sentientist view, while from a painist view, you would say that is important no matter who caused it. So that is also a very big difference.
I think that's an interesting distinction, because you could almost imagine a thought experiment where there's a world where all humans are now perfectly virtuous, but there's still a lot of suffering.
Yeah,
that's still a problem for me. So we haven't finished the problem. But it's interesting how you frame it, because I mean, personally, I do have a fairly consequentialist bias in my philosophy, because I tend to joke that, I'm all in favor of virtues and deontological rules as long as they can consistently deliver positive utility consequences. Because I think in a way that's how you explain why a virtue or a rule is good, is because it has good outcomes. That's a bit cheeky, and I'm not a proper philosopher. But at the same time, I'm also deliberately trying to frame sentientism as much more philosophically pluralistic than that. So I'm suggesting it's a naturalistic approach as opposed to supernatural, sentiocentric in that it accords moral consideration to all sentient beings. But there are people who will take a rights approach or a deontological approach or a virtue approach that will actually still use sentience as how they set their scope of moral consideration. So they might see kindness as a virtue, but kindness needs to be accorded to all sentient beings. Or they might take a deontological or a rights perspective and say it should be granted to all sentient beings. So I think those are still a sort of sentientist perspective in its broadest sense, because they're still setting the moral scope of consideration to include all sentient beings, even though they're using a plurality of different ethical approaches to then think about the trade-offs.
Yeah, it just probably is not so easy to arrive at the interests of wild animal suffering, for instance, if you are mainly focused on virtue ethics and doing the right thing. And
I would push back even to a virtue ethicist and say that being virtuous isn't just about acts of commission, it can also be acts of omission as well. So if suffering is going on, even if you haven't caused it, it's not virtuous to ignore that suffering. So I'd still even push back on a virtue ethicist and say we still have to get engaged with wild animal suffering. And I think I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole on wild animal suffering here, but I do think it's a fascinating topic, because at the same time, and you've mentioned this in your writing elsewhere, we already intervene at massive scale in nature. So it's not really a question of whether we intervene or not. It's a question of how we continue to. And while there are some really difficult, intractable, maybe problems in wild animal suffering that need a lot more research and thinking, there are also some really simple, low-risk interventions that we actually do already. So, there are areas in the UK and I think in Spain where people are shifting from, for example, culling certain types of animals to contraception, or they're using fencing and separation, or they're using wildlife corridors, or they're using... And it's a fascinating space, because it feels like the central gravity of the vegan movement is actually more anti about wild animal suffering than the general public. Whereas the general public, I'm on a WhatsApp group with the people who live in this local area, and almost half of the content is them caring about wild animals. They found an injured animal on the road, or a fox has taken a goose, and there's this direct empathy and compassion that they do not apply to farmed animals. So it's a really weird juxtaposition of perspectives, really. Whereas there is also one of the other problems that I think holds people back from thinking seriously about wild animal suffering is this sort of sense of a mystical reverence for nature. So if something is natural and it doesn't have humans in it, it must by definition be good, and therefore we should leave it alone. And I think people just radically underestimate not just the beauty and wonder of nature, but also the suffering that's going on there as well. I think there's a lot more valence in nature than
talking about naturalism and nature and God. To some extent, many people have replaced God with nature, and they see nature as something that has a plan and that has good intentions, and they may not be religious anymore in the original sense, and they think they may be not religious anymore, but if you just replace God with nature, then you're still religious, I think.
I agree. And that's partly why that's one of the only challenges with the term naturalism, is it sounds a bit like the appeal to nature fallacy, and it's absolutely a different thing. And I think it needs to resist exactly that sort of deification of nature in the same way as it resists the deification of some sort of a supernatural entity. And you can look at the theodicies, if there was a benevolent, omnipotent, omniscient God, why is there all this much suffering? And you can use exactly those challenges to say, clearly nature and evolution is not a compassionate process either. It's not at all. It's brutal.
Yeah.
So we should, I'm aware of your time because I'm taking up an hour of your time already, but if you're okay to go for a bit. I guess the final section of the conversation, which we've already danced around already, is thinking about the future. Often with my guests, we find ourselves in this strange situation where we find a sort of naturalistic way of understanding the universe to be almost self-evidently the best available approach to understanding what reality is. We find this focus on sentience as the prime characteristic for moral consideration to, again, almost be definition sound basis for morality. Why would you exclude any suffering from consideration? But we're in this weird position where nearly everyone on the planet disagrees with this, either because they have some supernatural frame of reference that often does warp their ethics, or because they have a scope of moral consideration in practical terms excludes many sentient beings from serious moral consideration. So we're in this weird sort of situation where maybe we might think we've got a sort of obvious answer, but it's very hard to persuade everybody else. So I guess there's a couple of ways of asking this future question. One is to go to the title of your book, How to Create a Vegan World. What might that sort of more utopian world look like across human ethics, non-human ethics of all sorts, to paint a picture of that? And then the second question is, again, the center of your work, really, pragmatically, strategically, how can we move towards it, given the weirdness of human psychology and social norms that we see all around us? So it's a crazily broad question, but address it how you like.
Yeah, I'll just, the vegan world in the sense of like abolishing human-caused animal suffering. That is, I think, a simple question, which is almost so simple that it becomes boring. There is not much discussion about it. I think that we should stop killing and exploiting animals for food and for other purposes. That is simple. And I think that it will also happen within this, and I don't know, somewhere this century, maybe. So that is it is a very big challenge. We still have to convince 7 billion people to change their eating habits and their consumption habits. So it is a big challenge, but theoretically the solution is there. That's not so difficult. And how we will get there, I think, is, and to some extent, it is a technological solution. It is by creating alternatives, or it is at least a combination of awareness and technological alternatives. So I think that I do believe in behavior and awareness change. I do believe in people changing, but only in combination with the presence of alternatives. If people have to make too much effort, it won't happen. But this happens, these alternatives, we are getting them, norms will change. When the norms change, when we have especially with cell cultivated meat, especially we will have that, we will have no more excuse to do anything else than eat that. We will have a majority of people following that norm, and then meat eating will become illegal. I can see all that happening quite naturally. If we don't bomb ourselves into the Stone Age, I think that is going to happen. I think, and I don't know how much you want to get into it, but the suffering of all other sentience on Earth is a much more complicated thing. So I think we can create bliss for humans. I think we will get there, but how do we create that for other beings on this planet? And I do think that we will play an important role in deciding who will still be here and how many of them will be here. We will decide at some point not to have farmed animals anymore, not to bring animals into the world just to kill them and eat them. That is going to disappear. The question is, what do we do with companion animals that we also created mostly for our own benefit, but what if they can have a wonderful life themselves? Is it wrong then to bring them into life? I don't think it necessarily is. I think it can be a perfect symbiosis between those creatures and ourselves. There are the animals that live on the threshold between human and the natural world, the liminal animals, which are the rats and the pigeons and the squirrels, etc. I don't know if we want to have them like in abundance, or if we want to limit them somehow, or if they will be limited by the limitation of our food or whatever. And there is the question then of wild animals. How many of them do we want to be around? What lives do they have? If we come to the conclusion that their lives, or in many cases, their lives are sufficiently bad, then what do we want to do about that? I think that population control will be one of the most important things that there is. I think you have to, on the one hand, you have to make sure not too many animals or not too many beings are being brought into the world, as long as there's finite resources and finite possibilities for being happy and have a high well-being. And on the other hand, you also have to have absolutely a way to minimize pain and suffering, certainly at the end of animals' lives, or when they're going to be killed, or and humans as well. We have to have a way to like really painlessly euthanize whoever is suffering if there is no other way. So those two ways of controlling, and of course, many people will be horrified at this idea of like us wanting to control something and its hubris, etc. Even if it is benign, it will all lead to wrong consequences. I think we have to, like, if we have the right intentions and if we base ourselves on science and if we take our time and if we don't do anything rushed, then down the road, we can create some solutions that are actually good for other sentient beings who might be suffering a lot. And we can prevent them from coming into existence, or we can help them to ideally lead a good life, or we can help them to like gracefully exit from existence.
Yeah. And I think it's almost the flip side of this fear about human hubris and the approach we sometimes take. We bulldoze into situations and for our own interests. But the other side of that is that if we recognize wild animal suffering is a moral problem, and arguably it's a very large scale, intense moral problem, there's no one else that has the capacity to fix it apart from the human species. So some will criticize that way of thinking of is playing God, or again human hubris, but no one else is coming to help. So we either abandon that problem completely, or, as you say, with one of your other phrases, slow opinion and proper research and caution and motivated by compassion, there might be ways we can make that work. And this can feel like quite a long-term sci-fi question, but it's something I think we need to be thinking about right now as well, because hopefully as we move towards that complete abolition of animal farming, one of the benefits from that is it frees up vast tranches of land that we can rewild. And I think we right now need to be thinking about what sort of ecosystems exist there, because rewilding neutrally will create more suffering than not rewilding, right? So we need to think about the length of the trophic chains, what's the nature of the suffering that's going on in those environments. So even now, I think that sort of universally compassionate perspective can help us avoiding creating new problems, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it is like you say, I mean, and this, whatever, if people think that this sounds like hubris, I don't think it is, but we are the only ones who can do it. If you want ever a planet or a system or a universe without horrible suffering, then you need at least one intelligence to raise to an incredible advanced level. Yeah. And we are not there yet, but we are the closest that you can get. And if we disappear, you've lost millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years or whatever. So we have, and it's funny, I'm just reading this book, which you may have read, The Precipice. Yeah. So he says, we may be around for thousands and millions and billions of years, and we could reach so much bliss, such a blissful state. And then he argues, if it needs to be done, if I need to argue for it at all, why should we continue to exist? And then he mentions some reasons, because it will be very good in the future, but he doesn't mention, and I find it's very strange, like he doesn't mention the reason that we could care for other. Like he doesn't mention that, which is, a very big gap, I think.
That's fascinating, because I think you can have a sort of human supremacist approach to anthropocentrism, which says that only humans matter. But you can also have a very rich sentientist philosophy, which says one of the reasons humans matter so much is because of the potential to do good and harm to all other sentient beings. I think you're right. There's an important central point there.
It's my one reason why we shouldn't go extinct. Is because
of our potential.
We could have help, and we could help all the other ones, and maybe even beings on other planets we might one day discover that there's so much suffering there. Imagine that you discover there's so much suffering on this planet, but imagine that we solve it all, and then we see like a planet in Alpha Centauri system or whatever, and we see, oh my God, there's so much suffering going on there. And then maybe one day we have the chance of going there or do something about it. So yeah, we definitely in a prime position, and that's what I agree with in his book. We are at a crucial period that we have to, like, we are at a precipice that we have to conquer, and if we do, then there's a lot of possibilities.
And while we're thinking about utopian or dystopian far futures, what's your sense about the potential for both alien sentience and artificial sentience as well? Do you think we could go beyond? There's anti-speciesism, but there's also anti-substratism. Can you imagine there being conscious experiences that aren't just biologically evolved in our tree of life? Because that's part of the reason I like the idea of focusing on sentience, because it says, pretty much on this planet, sentience overlaps with being an animal, pretty much. But at least philosophically, it's quite interesting to be future-proofed and open-minded about whether there are other forms of sentience.
With aliens, to me, it's obvious that there exists well-being or the lack of well-being elsewhere in the universe. I don't know if we'll ever come in contact with it or not. That's another question, but it does. I think it does exist. And they might have another, or it might be based on another substrate, or we might invent artificial sentience in the future. And I don't know if we want to like do that. I suppose it's possible to invent it, and I guess it will be possible. But I think if I could decide with a conscious decision not to do that, not to invent artificial sentience, I would say stop. I would say let's not do it, because the chances of like it being or it having a lot of opportunity to be unhappy or to experience misery, etc., seem to be quite high. And then you have to wonder, okay, if we bring life or sentience into this world and it's not going to be at least sufficiently happy, then I guess we should not do it. And conversely, and that's maybe the case with some companion animals, you could say to some extent that we created them by breeding them. We didn't invent their life, but we created their personality and their biology, etc. In cases where you create or people create a life that is really like happy overall and can also give happiness to others, to like their human companions, that might be something that is very worthwhile. Yeah, you also have this whole population ethics question of, is it like, should we be happy about happy lives or just neutral about happy lives being brought into the world? We didn't touch that, but those are very complicated questions that I haven't really entirely gotten around.
Challenging space, isn't it? Presentism
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, just to draw you back to, I guess, the more immediate challenge of essentially working to transition to end animal farming, there are many different debates and battles going on within the animal advocacy movement and vegan movements about the best way of doing that. And one challenge that is often presented to your way of thinking, which I have a lot of sympathy with, because I partly just through my memory of my own ethical and intellectual transition on this journey, I try and remember who I was and use that to have compassion for the people who haven't seen what you and I have seen, and the power of social norms and the indoctrination that nearly every human goes through are so powerful that it's very rare that people have that capacity intellectually or emotionally to do the hard moral work to get to where we are. And shame and challenge and moral argument does work with some people, and many of my guests are those strange, wonderful people. But it seems like that approach by itself is going to take a long time. So I do have a lot of empathy for your suggested approach of being pragmatic, being engaging, being positive, presenting alternatives, making it easy for people to do the right thing. And one of the challenges that I sometimes hear is that there's a worry about those types of approaches that we're going to either enable more suffering or enable the industry to greenwash or ethics wash itself, that we're going to provide people with a sort of ethical escape route that allows them to still cause suffering but feel better about themselves because they've convinced themselves they're on a journey. So many of those concerns are about that we'll find some way of finding ourselves in a sort of welfarist dead end where, because the animal agriculture industries have managed to greenwash and ethics wash, and the messaging has persuaded people that we're on a different sides of the journey, we've found ourselves in a position where now everyone's comfortable ethically, but we're still doing awful suffering. So there's this, I think that's partly where the worry comes from. There's a fear about these sort of dead ends that we're going to find ourselves in, or excuses we're going to make, or enabling. And I should let you answer the question, but because you're very clear that your end goal is the abolition of all animal farming and exploitation in that sense. What's your thought about how to frame that argument and how to reassure people that we're driving towards ultimately the same goal, even though we have different philosophies about how to get there.
If you look at incrementalism, like making things better piece by piece rather than abolitionist campaigning, etc., incrementalism come in two forms. It can be about like better meat and like animals that are less suffering and they have it better and they have bigger cages, etc. That's one thing. And the other one is like incrementalism towards like less meat and to have more options, etc. So I am more confident about the second incrementalist way than the first. I think the first, I'm a proponent of like welfare campaigns, but I can see that maybe at some point there could be like a situation where you like have animals in such conditions that people say, oh, it's not that much of a problem. But I think that would be, and I'm not sure about that at all, because I can also see that people like who started to care about animals and about their tiny cages their caring would not stop and it would like just continue and they would say like, why would we eat them at all? But I think especially in combination with the other incrementalist approach where you have more and more plant-based alternatives, you create a norm, you create a situation where people say, oh my God, this is good food. I don't need the other food anymore. It will just become much more easy to care about these other things. So I think it is going to be a technological revolution before a moral revolution, basically. Yeah. And I also think that once
and I think the key thing for me is that I think you're right. I think the technical revolution will come first and the moral revolution can follow. But we need to make sure that moral revolution follows as well. I think part of the fear is that if we just do the technical stuff and we forget the morality, there is a risk of some dead ends. Whereas I think it does need both. It needs that drive. And I think you can see that in quite a lot of human social change, where actually it was a technical change or a behavior change or a norm change that then made it easy for the ethics to drive through and say, it almost freed people to act more morally, but we still need that moral angle.
We still need it. And what I always say to like abolitionists and abolitionists in a narrow sense and people who like deplore the fact that I would say that you can't go shout to people, meat is murder, etc. I would say that there will come a time. There will be a time for that as well. Yeah. What we are doing now with all these alternatives is creating a fertile breeding ground for that kind of campaigning. So if you have a lot of people, like you can't do that on the basis of nothing, but if you have a lot of people who are already involved and who are like, to some extent, like knowing that there is alternatives and we don't need slaughter, we don't need this and that, at some point, I think more aggressive tactics will become more and more productive and fruitful. Yeah. And therefore
there'll be less and less excuses for people.
Yeah, exactly. And so the people who are dying to stand on the barricades and to really fight, and it's more fun. It's more fun than being a pragmatist, I can tell you. They will have their time and they can do it already now. Yeah. But it will be more productive in the future. And I can see a time for like really literally animal liberation and maybe even, a destruction of property that we will consider in the future the way we are considering tools to keep slaves in confinement today. And we will be in our right to destroy them and or to steal them or whatever. So I think that this radicalism will have its day. And maybe it won't be necessary, but I think, it might still very well be necessary, even if it is just to get the 5 remaining percent in order or something.
Finish the job. And the other thing I think that is, as I've had these conversations, that is encouraging is I think there is a broader understanding of all of the different levers we can pull at different levels to move these agendas forward. So, of course, there's the individual choices around consumption and so on, but there's also the individual role that each of us can play in driving institutional change as voters, as consumers, as stakeholders and shareholders and managers and employees and letter writers and petitioners. And then there's all the different layers of institutional change and levers you can pull. So there's some interesting petitions going on for local councils in the UK at the moment, trying to reject planning permission for a new rabbit farm or a new factory pig farm. There's Animal Rebellion's very direct engagement in trying to disrupt some of these workflows and these processes and, again, bring the issues to a wider public image. There are initiatives going on at national and regional level as well. The UK is, since we've sadly left the EU, has been saying the EU recognised animal sentience. We're now going to recognise animal sentience in UK law. And of course, they will exclude animal agriculture from that. But it still feels like a step toward recognising the challenge. And even at the international governance level, there are initiatives at the the UN with the UN CAP and UDOR, and there are flaws and problems with all of them, but there are initiatives at almost every layer of that institutional stack trying to push this agenda that recognizes all sentience matters and we need to drive some radical change. So I found that generally encouraging. I don't know if you have a sense about that sort of institutional individual dynamic and how it's moving, but
yeah, I'm quite hopeful as well. And you need, of course, enough public demand, enough public commotion to like get these institutions in motion. But then on the other hand, it can also go the other way, that the institutions are ahead and they influence the constituents.
Yeah, I had a fascinating example, again, from human ethics earlier today, where the topic of same-sex marriage in the UK, the polling public opinion radically shifted in favor of same-sex marriage after it had been legalized. So again, it's not just a public opinion has to shift and then the law and governments and institutions follow. Quite often they can play, the governments and the law institutions can play a leading role in pushing public opinion too.
Yeah, same example with the death penalty. I think like that more people became against it after the death penalty was abolished, things like that. So you can apparently legalize morality to some extent, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's been absolutely fascinating. I think you've given us a sort of a roadmap for an immediate future and sort of some hints at your potential utopian vision as well. So it's been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you. Are there any other things you want to lay into the conversation before we start to wrap up?
There's so much to talk about, and these issues are really, really very fascinating. Yeah, I think we've discussed a lot, but we could also go on for hours still.
Yeah, I'd love to have another conversation as well. Yeah. So before we wrap up, how can people best follow you and learn about your work? And
well, that might be a while, but yeah. So I have the website veganstrategist.org, where I blog very irregularly. I have people who can follow me on Facebook and Twitter, just my name. Yeah, that's about the main ways to follow me.
That's great.
And the book is called How to Create a Vegan World, and it's, you can buy it on Amazon, for instance.
Good stuff. Thank you. It's great to have you in our Sentientism Facebook group as well. It's good to be building the community. And yeah, hopefully this conversation will help to nudge a few more people towards rational, compassionate thinking. So Thank you very much for spending the time with me today.
Thank you. And thanks for all the work that you do.
Pleasure. Take care.
Bye.